Hey everyone, welcome to Reddit Stories video. Today we're diving into a fascinating and chilling topic, horrifying true Reddit stories. These stories are all verified, and let me warn you, some are deeply unsettling. I'm especially excited about this one because true stories have a unique way of drawing us in. Whether you're studying, relaxing, trying to sleep, or just looking for some entertainment, this video is perfect for any situation. Before we jump into these spine-tingling stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're working toward the goal of reaching 1,000 subscribers, so your support would mean the world to us. All right, without further ado, let's get into some horrifying true Reddit stories. I'm not going to hurt you? Remembering these words still sends a chill up my spine. This was a few years ago. My 33-year-old husband, 43-year-old, and I were getting gas late one night. This was a bit of a weird gas station, where two roads intersected at an angle with the gas station being on the acute angle, if you can picture that. At the pump we chose, there were no working lights and it was difficult to see directly from either road. We were driving a soft-top Jeep Wrangler with all of the rear windows taken off. My husband got out to pump and I was sitting in the passenger seat looking at my phone. That's when I heard it. "I'm not going to hurt you," a wavery voice said some distance behind me. I froze, suddenly terrified. I turned around to look out the empty space where our back window used to be and saw what appeared to be a homeless man a little ways off. He had slightly wild gray hair, a washed-out beanie, and an oversized jacket with lots of pockets that hid his hands. I suddenly realized how dark it was and how hard it was for anyone to see us, and I couldn't see his hands. I had a distinct feeling from deep down, so prominent I could almost hear it. "Run!" "But we're just pumping gas. He's just a weird homeless dude." My husband and I were from Key West. We had seen plenty of them before, and they were almost all harmless. So I slowly turned back around and went back to my phone. Yet I still heard him, the distinct sound of shuffling feet, the rustle of his jacket. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said again. "I just need some help. Do you have any money? I'm not going to hurt you." At this point, I could tell he was almost at the Jeep. We had only been there a couple of minutes, and we'd been on almost empty. There was no way the tank was full. Without warning, my husband rushed into the car and hurried to start the engine. I could tell his hands were shaking. He managed to throw the car into drive and we peeled out of there. I looked behind us and saw the man standing there, not reacting, next to the dangling nozzle my husband hadn't bothered hanging back up. As we turned out of the gas station, my husband said, "I just had the most horrible feeling. Something in me just told me to run." I looked at him in horror and told him I'd felt the same thing. I felt tears come to my eyes as I thanked him for listening to his instincts. We went home feeling quite shaken, just going over the events we had just seen and the fear we had felt. It was a day or two later that we watched a YouTube video by a security analyst, Scott Stewart, on the Kenyan mall shooting, and he said that in every event like this, there are people who said, right before it happened, "I had a terrible feeling that something bad was about to happen." He adds that some people listen to that feeling and leave the area, while others mention how much they regret not listening to it. I burst into tears hearing this, knowing the feeling he had described all too well. I had had that feeling and was one of those who ignored it. I remember crying, "Thank you," at my husband for listening to his sense of danger. Now it is fully possible this was just a harmless person asking for money in a slightly creepy way, and that nothing bad would have happened. But I can't stop remembering how the weird angles kept anyone from seeing us. I can't stop thinking about how dark it was, and I can't stop thinking about his hidden hands. And I still get full body chills remembering him say, "I'm not going to hurt you." Moral of the story, I guess, if you ever get that distinct feeling that something bad is imminent, leave the area. It may be a false alarm, and if it happens a lot, you may have a hyperactive anxiety response and might want to try Lexapro. But it's better than going through the rest of your life wishing you had listened to that feeling. She poisoned me. My parents got married while still in high school. I wouldn't recommend this. The 12th grade to be exact. They were legal adults. I came just a year later when my mom was 19 and my dad was 20. We lived in a one-bedroom upstairs apartment in a crappy complex. I slept in my crib until I started climbing out of it and finding my way into my parents' bed or into trouble. When I was 4, my parents decided I needed my own room, so they upgraded to a 2-bedroom downstairs apartment in the same complex. They fought horribly all the time, but outside of that, everything was pretty normal. I made a few friends with other children around the complex, and a cousin and her 3 kids also lived in the complex. Everything was fine until a new neighbor moved in next door when I was 6. Immediately, this lady didn't like me and she didn't hide it. I was at school when she moved in, but on the weekends when I went out to ride my big wheel bike and play, she stood in her door and glared at me with the most hateful look a person could give a child. To be honest, I didn't like her either. Something about her bothered my spirit greatly, though. At the time, I didn't understand why. It's like she could sense my presence outside and would literally spawn outdoors just to glare daggers at me and mutter things under her breath. I felt an evil presence on her and started making a cross with my fingers whenever I saw her. This enraged her and she lied and told my mom that I threw her a middle finger. My mom believed me instead. Strange things started happening in my room at night. I had a rocking horse. It was beautiful and I enjoyed playing on it. However, it started rocking on its own whenever I tried to sleep. My parents heard this as the springs made a distinctive noise. I had one of those dolls that eyes open and close depending on if it's lying down or sitting up. The doll's eyes would sometimes remain open while lying down, or it would blink, scaring the crap out of me. There would be strange knocking noises in my wall. My parents heard this as well, and they permitted me to sleep with them in bed. One day, my mom and I got locked out of our apartment. This was before everyone had cell phones in the 90s, and our cousin wasn't home. My mom, against my pleas, knocked on the neighbor's door to use her phone. She let us in, glaring at me the entire time. I never let go of Mom's hand or came from behind her leg. In her house, on her wall were multiple upside-down crosses, strange-looking masks, some with horns. There were candles everywhere, and small, colorful bottles with powder in them. My mom looked around like WTF, but kept her composure. She held my hand tighter, made the phone call to my dad at his job to hurry back now, and we quickly exited the apartment after thanking the woman. She watched me as we left. My mom told my dad everything, and he told his father, my grandfather, who was a pastor. He immediately brought us a bottle of prayed-over olive oil, holy oil, to anoint our house. My mom also told her side of the family, who were very strict Christians, and they were, for a lack of a better word, flabbergasted, and started a prayer meeting. A few days later, we noticed at our back door a white powder substance across the threshold. My mom poured some of the oil on it, and it absorbed it and disappeared. The woman later tried to offer me some candy, which I declined, though I love sweets. My nickname was Sugar Ant because I loved junk so much. I had made friends with a little girl in the complex that lived on the other side. One day she had some soft chews and offered me one. Like an idiot, I accepted and ate it. It didn't take long before I fell violently ill. Fever, sweating, skin darkened, dark circles around the eyes. Nothing given to me at the doctors helped. I couldn't keep anything down. On intuition, my mom asked did I accept and eat anything from anyone, and I confessed to accepting candy from a friend. She asked around and found out the girl was the granddaughter of our next-door neighbor. My dad called over my grandfather and my mom, her family. They anointed me with holy oil and made a prayer circle around me and started speaking in tongues. I was in and out of consciousness. My grandfather lifted me up and made me drink some of the oil. I remember it burning my throat. Suddenly, I had to throw up. I leaped from the couch where I was laying and sprinted to the bathroom, where I started throwing up a thick, black sludge. A lot came out. My mom was shaking and on the verge of tears. Everyone continued praying in tongues. I threw up for a while until it was all out. I suddenly felt a lot better. I was fussed at for accepting food from strangers, even friends. The adults talked while I rested. After a few days, the woman saw that I was fine. This time I glared at her back as I was angry. I was young, but I understood she had tried to poison me for no reason. I made the cross sign again with my fingers, and she went back in her house and slammed her door. She moved out sometime after that. There's only 5 of us on this camping trip. We keep counting 6. There were bright flashes of red in the sky. It's as if someone was waving around a flare light from space, faint but noticeable. We all made UFO jokes and laughed as we nailed our tents into the ground. I knew for sure that there were 5 of us. We have all been friends since early middle school, and we're celebrating our high school graduation with this getaway camping trip. The flashes of red must have stopped randomly as we made conversation while fixing up our tents. Dave managed to put his tent together the fastest and told us he was going to find some branches for the fire. I remember how he had worked with me at the local gas station last year. We used to do the night shift together, and it had made working at a desolate gas station much more fun than it was supposed to be. There was also Eric in the corner, still reading his tent manual, fidgeting with his signature round glasses. I wasn't as close with Eric as I was with the others, but I still remember sitting with him in math class and copying his homework one time. Ava was also there talking with Sally, my cousin. Both had decided to team up and work on one tent at a time. I also have clear memories of them, hanging around at school in our usual places. In fact, I even knew Ava's younger brother, as he used to beg to go with us wherever we went. I bring all this up because I'm sure that there were 5 of us, including me, and that I knew everyone in the group. So Dave went to get some branches as we pulled out some foldable chairs and set them up around the fire pit. I remember feeling uneasy as the sun set and darkness began to consume the forest. The shadows of trees elongated around us as the minutes ticked by. Eric went to get a flashlight from his bag while we wondered what was taking Dave so long. He appeared soon after, the harsh rustling sounds of the bushes signifying his return. We were all buried in our chairs at this point, covered by our jackets. The temperature had dropped quickly, and a slight breeze was beginning to pick up. "Geez, you guys weren't even bothered to pull out a chair for me," Dave said as he arranged all the branches in the pit. We had set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to rationalize the situation, but no matter how hard I focused, my head felt like it was underwater. I had perfect clarity up until that moment, but when I tried to focus on why 5 chairs were occupied when Dave hadn't sat down yet, my head seemed to just stop working, as if something was reaching in and pulling out my thoughts. Instinctually, I felt even more uneasy now, and I had placed why. The whole forest had gone dead silent. I looked around at the faces of the others and could tell that they had felt the same. Eric was fidgeting with his fingers, trying to scan around the group and spot the extra person, but it was futile. I scanned every face, each etched in worry and frowning in frustration except for, "It's all right, I'll get the chair myself," Dave said, breaking the silence and somewhat alleviating the tension. I got up and offered to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We headed away from the fire pit towards the tents, but I kept my eyes glued on our group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Dave as he looked around and realized that we had indeed only packed 5 chairs. In fact, every person had brought with them their own chair. They were heavy to carry, and we wouldn't bring any extra needlessly. "There's 5, right?" "I mean, there's 5 chairs," Dave replied. His voice wavered as he spoke. "No, I just think maybe one of us forgot our chair," I said. My mind was struggling to address the issue head-on and now sought to find rational excuses instead. I didn't quite feel in control of my thoughts. It felt like swimming in a dream, and if I tried to force myself to think about who the 6th person was, my head would begin to throb. "Yeah, that sounds about right, actually," Dave said, relaxing and heading back to the group. When we walked back to the fire pit and circle of chairs, 2 chairs were empty, one for me and one for Dave. Everything was adding up now, even though we all agreed it wasn't before. Sally suggested we were all probably tired after the long hike to get here and probably just needed some sleep. She could have been right. We were all sleep-deprived from waking up very early today to make it on time. Ava brought out the drinks. The whole 6-pack was emptied. We all moved closer to the crackling fire for warmth as we took sips from our cans and reminisced on memories of last year. Ava was in the middle of telling us about that one time she was home alone with weird things happening in her house when I got these sudden chills despite the pleasant warmth of the fire. What felt cozy and safe moments ago felt wrong now, all because I realized that there was a crucial detail I missed. "Who started the fire?" I asked, completely interrupting Ava in the middle of her story and breaking everyone else's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again, I scanned the faces, staring back at me, all barely illuminated by the light from the fire, all familiar and pale from fear. "Wasn't it you, Dave?" Eric asked. Dave shook his head. I think the person standing behind Jenny did it, Sally said, looking over at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except for the encompassing darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall, dark trees behind me made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. Wait, I I don't know, Sally said. Her eyes had gone wide and she was shaking visibly. She continued to look around frantically as Ava moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. I think we should leave this place, Ava stuttered. Yeah, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it, Dave said. But it's so dark out in the forest now. We'd probably get lost if we leave now. Someone else said, yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow. Eric agreed. I tried to protest, but realized Eric was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness within which navigation would be near impossible. Let's not sleep in our separate tents just to be safe, Sally said. We all agreed. We only brought one person tents with us, but we could squeeze two if we tried. That way, no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation, we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Dave and Sally like always went with Ava. Eric kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point we all realized that there were only 5 of us, and suddenly we were all huddling up in the middle of the clearing. Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us here? Eric asked. Sweat was dripping down his face despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone on his own, under the assumption that there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and... I was pointing at each of them as I said the name. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Sally. The left side of my head felt like there was a knife stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Dave held me up to stop me from collapsing, and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Dave helped me into a tent while the 4 outside discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain beating against my skull came and went in waves. Sally had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together so their openings faced together at right angles in a sort of U shape so we could sleep as close as possible and also limit the entrance to our tents. Dave was about to go to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he was more comfortable with it since all the tents were very close now. Looking back now, I think he was just trying to put a brave face on for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated in our group and knew that none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose in the morning. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was just pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me. With the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing, I turned my head to look over at the 2 tents we had left out and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking into Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it, his head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it, with the blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The 5 of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny, please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point, there were 3 of us running on the trail. Dave and I shoulder to shoulder while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my rib cage, and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face, and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear as the sounds of a struggle grew behind me. I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended, and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds. I'm typing this post out at a rest stop. My phone has finally regained service, and I've called 911 to try and explain the situation. I don't think they believe my version of events, but they sent a car my way regardless. As I wait, the sun is finally starting to rise. After I hit the post button on this, I'm gonna check why the person in my backseat has been so silent the whole time. True EMS horror story. I worked as a dispatcher for a pretty small ambulance station near a fairly large city in the middle of the US. IDK how specific I can be since this is a true story. And I'm going to tell one of the craziest stories I have from this job. We had a patient who we will call Susan. She was a dialysis patient, and one of the services we offered was to take very unwell or disabled patients to and from these dialysis appointments. She lived with her son, who we will call David. He was in his late 40s and his mother, Susan, in her late 70s or so. Every week, like clockwork, we would have a unit bring Susan to and from her dialysis treatments 3 times a week. Everyone knew her at the station because we had been doing this for quite some time with Susan. We were all familiar with her and her son, whether it was the crew seeing her in person and taking care of her, or speaking to her or her son on the phone frequently about the appointments as I had done. Everyone knew her. Naturally, when crews had news about her health, they would report back to keep everyone in the loop with how she was. At one point, she was not feeling well at all, but she wanted to go to her dialysis appointment, so naturally we obliged and took her in. At this appointment, while receiving dialysis treatment, she lost consciousness and was promptly taken by our crew to the hospital. When it was time again for her dialysis appointment, we gave the hospital a call to see if she had been released and was able to go to the appointment. The hospital staff informed us that she would likely be released the following day and would be receiving that dialysis treatment in the hospital. Then the next treatment time rolled around, and we called the hospital and we were told she had been released from their care the other day. This was great news, but a little strange due to the fact that we were always her first call to transport her to or from any hospital or appointment, and we hadn't transported her anywhere. We quickly moved on, however, and called David, her son, to see if she was going to be requiring us for her treatment that day. He informed us she wasn't feeling well and that she wasn't up to it, but that he was considering taking her back into the hospital. We tell him that if he needs us to just give us a call, and until further notice, we cancel her trip for the day. We never get a call. Next appointment rolls around and we call David again to ask if she will be going. He says she's sick and she's back in the hospital. Weird again since we hadn't taken her, but doesn't seem that off considering her health had been deteriorating. Next appointment, same thing happens. We call David, his mom's in the hospital, we move on. Now is where things took a bit of a turn. When the next appointment came up, we had tried calling David to ask about his mother's status, but he never answered or returned our calls. So being that we had a contract with Susan and were to take her to these appointments unless told otherwise, we sent a crew to collect her for treatment. When the crew arrived at scene, they knocked on the door to no response. They knocked again and were greeted by David smoking a cigarette. David seeming surprised, the crew said they were there to pick up Susan for her appointment. David responded stating he had forgotten to call, but Susan was still in the hospital not doing well. The crew gave their best wishes and David shut the door. But the crew felt like something was off. They immediately radioed to dispatch that something was wrong and they requested we call the hospital. David said she was to see if she was still there. The hospital had no record of her being there since we last knew. So we had the crew leave the scene and we called for a welfare check on Susan at her son's home. We heard nothing the rest of the day from police, David, Susan, or anyone else involved. The next morning I came into work and the very first call I took began with, "This is Sheriff. I'm calling to report back on the welfare check you asked us to perform yesterday." I was nervous as he sounded concerned, and I didn't really expect them to call us back with any news. He proceeded to let me know that upon arrival to the home, they spoke with David, who was adamant his mother didn't feel well, but that she was home from the hospital. The police asked to just check on Susan to make sure she was all right, and eventually David obliged, letting the police in. Once entering the home, they were met with a grim scene, though I imagine they smelled it first. They continued to explain that what the officers observed was the dead body of Susan propped up on the couch wrapped in blankets, as if watching the television. But she had been dead for a while. They approximated around 2 weeks. When speaking to David, they found that he had been changing her clothes regularly and watching TV with her. Obviously, he was suffering from some sort of mental issue and grief. But the thing was, he had never taken good care of her until she was dead. No news coverage. No updates from police further than that. Nothing. Stuff like this happens in your hometown and you'll never know. Crazy, right? I watched my coworker get arrested and then found out he had a sinister plan for me. I worked with this man for a little over 3 years. We worked pretty closely on some projects over the last 2 years and even sat near one another at work. In September, I showed up and saw about 10 detectives at my place of work. I was a bit startled, as this was quite unusual for my area. I looked around and saw that my coworker was in handcuffs and looked quite disheveled, which wasn't out of the norm, to be honest. I walked up to the detectives, introduced myself, and let them know who I was in relation to him. I asked what was going on, and they filled me in on why he was currently being arrested. For the sake of the case, I won't share more than he was a disgusting person. Over the course of the next 3 hours, I watched as they dismantled his workstation, went through his belongings, took evidence pictures, and so on. I was pulled in and out of rooms, answering questions about his character, what I knew of him, and my feelings about him as a person. I told them he gave me a weird feeling in my gut, that I've always told my husband I wouldn't be surprised if the cops ever did come looking for him, that my husband even thought he was weird, and if I ever went missing that he'd be the first person to be suspected. Didn't realize how real this almost was. The detective on site told me that they served a search warrant at his home and were looking there for any evidence. It sounds like they found more than they anticipated and were looking to see if there was anything else, unrelated to what they were currently investigating. I was asked my name and my husband's name for confirmation for something they found, which I did think was odd, but I let it go and called my husband to update him on the happenings of the day thus far. However, the last hour I was pulled in for the final time and advised by one of the lead detectives, who couldn't even look at me, that I needed to ensure I was safe and protected in the event they didn't book him that day. Come to find out, he had been journaling about me over the course of at least a year, saying he wanted to be with me, but the problem was that I was married. His journal then lined out a plan to set my husband up for cheating on me, and the end resulted in my death caused by him, my coworker. The officer said that everything in between was more vile than he's ever heard, to the point he was crying when he was telling me to make sure I was safe. Crying, a detective, and didn't want to scare me. Thankfully, he was charged and looking at a long time in prison, but I still think about it. It keeps me up at night. It just shows you never really know someone, even your coworkers. My neighbor has been beckoning my children from his window at night. I, 33 male, live in Texas with my daughter Alicia, 8 female, and my son Jay, 4 male. Their mom has been out of the picture for the past 2 years, not dead, just a piece of shit, and I've managed pretty well as a single father. The three of us lived in a 2-bedroom in a nice neighborhood. I've got a solid job, and the kids are thankfully healthy. Everything was smooth sailing until one night, 2 months ago, during which I was awoken by Jay poking me in the face. He was sobbing violently, though I recognized it as the "I'm afraid" kind of crying, as opposed to the "I'm hurt" kind of crying, which made me a little less worried. Jay's always been nightmare prone, so I assumed that's what was causing him distress. When I asked him what was wrong though, he said, "The man in the next house is making scary faces at me." I'd heard my fair share of Jay's stories about monsters terrorizing him from the dark corners of his bedroom, but this was something new. I assumed he meant our neighbor's house, and the lack of fantastical elements in his description made me uneasy. It felt too specific to be one of his usual nightmares. I got out of bed and walked with Jay in tow to my kids' room. Alicia was awake in the top bunk. From the soft glow of their nightlight, I could see her crossing her arms and scowling down at her little brother. I didn't turn on any lights to give myself a better view of the outdoors and peered out the bedroom window. Their window had curtains on it, but for once they hadn't been drawn all the way, and there was a small opening between them through which Jay must have looked out. One side of the neighbor's house, the one to our left from the street, was visible from Alicia and Jay's room. There were 2 windows on the neighbor's side of the house, but it was too dark inside to see anything. I recalled from what I'd seen in the daylight that the window on the left, the one closest to the front of the house, was the kitchen. I wasn't sure what the window on the right was, as it always had its curtains drawn. I asked Alicia if she'd seen anything, and she shook her head. "He's always having nightmares and crying. I don't want to share a room with him anymore, Dad. I never get any sleep. It's not fair." Of course, hearing that made Jay start crying again, so I let him sleep in my room for the night. He has this TMNT indoor camping tent that he prefers to his actual bed. Honestly, at that point, I half suspected his nightmare to be a ploy to get me to let him camp. Anyway, I guess I'm a total pushover because he slept in that tent in my room for the next 2 nights. On the 3rd night, I was again woken up, but this time by Alicia, who was standing over me and shaking my arm. That kid hadn't woken me up in the middle of the night for years. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, "The neighbor was making faces at me." Those words and the fear in my daughter's voice really put me on edge. I closed the curtains when I said goodnight. "Did you open them?" "Only a little, but it's 'cause I heard a weird noise." "What did you hear?" Alicia couldn't recall exactly. According to her, she had gotten out of bed to see what was going on, and when she lifted the curtains, she saw a light on in the neighbor's window. The curtains in the back room had been drawn back, and our neighbor was standing in his house, right up against the window frame. "What was he doing?" Alicia thought for a moment and then made an expression I never want to see on my child's face, or anyone else's for that matter ever again. I won't do it justice by describing it, but it looked something like this. First, she smiled with both sets of teeth, so that there was a little open sliver between the rows, and then she furrowed her eyebrows. She inclined her head towards me, kind of Kubrick stare-esque, and strained the muscles in her neck. The worst part, though, was what she did with her hands. She held out her left arm, forearm up. Then she clenched her right hand into a fist and moved it back and forth rapidly over her forearm. Poor thing described it as playing the violin, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that my neighbor was pantomiming cutting. Disturbed, I told Alicia to stop and to not make either the expression or the gesture again. I was angry and confused. My neighbor, a man in his 40s, was a bit of a recluse, but he had seemed normal enough in the 3 or 4 times I'd spoken to him. I couldn't fathom why he would do something like that to my kids. After asking Alicia a few more questions, I realized that my neighbor might not have done anything technically, or at least legally wrong. It wasn't against the law to make inappropriate gestures in your own home, but it seemed like he was targeting my kids specifically. Legal or not, I planned to have a little chat with him the following morning. My last question to Alicia was if our neighbor had made any other gestures, and she nodded. Then she started making beckoning, "come here" motions with both of her hands. I had Alicia sleep in my room for the night as well. I also checked out the window in my kids' room, but like before, I saw nothing. The house was completely dark. The next morning before work and after dropping Alicia and Jay off to school, I spent a good 5 minutes knocking on my neighbor's front door. I figured he was home since his car was in the driveway, but he never answered the door. Eventually, I had to leave for work, and as I was walking away, I turned around quickly to see if he was watching me. He was. The coward. I saw him for a split second at the front window before he ducked beneath the sill and out of view. Clearly, the guy had problems. I yelled out to him to stop fucking with us and then left. That same night, I put a plan in motion. While my kids slept in my room, I hung out in theirs. It was a Friday night, and I was ready to pull an all-nighter so that I could catch my neighbor in the act. Although I trusted my kids, I wanted to confirm that there was actually something nefarious going on before I escalated things. I made sure the house was locked up and all the curtains drawn, tucked my kids in, and sat on the floor under the window in their room. At around 9, I started marathoning midnight mass on my phone. I didn't want to wear headphones and miss any strange sounds, so I kept the volume low and mostly read subtitles. At midnight, I started to hear strange sounds. Like Alicia said, it's a bit hard to describe. Best I can do is that it was this low, repeated clicking sound. You know the chick sound you make to beckon a horse? It was something like that. All I knew is that the sound was undoubtedly coming from a person. After a few minutes of this, the sound switched to what I think was supposed to be a whistle, but it came out all wrong, like someone sucking breath in through their teeth. The sound was so crisp that the neighbor's window must have been open, which was an unsettling thought given that there was only around 15 feet of space between our houses. Certain that the neighbor was at his window and that this was my best chance to see him, I stood up and pulled the curtain back in one motion. I saw him right away. There was a dim light on in his room, allowing me to see that horrible expression Alicia had made the night prior. It was one thing to see my child's recreation, but it was far more frightening on an adult. His window was indeed open, and his arms were stuck out into the cold night, violently swiping against each other in a grotesque mimicry of self-harm. When he saw me and realized that he was looking at another grown man and not some poor child, he stopped his erratic motions. His cartoonish grin faded, and another, more genuine emotion settled over his features. Rage. The man grabbed the window and slammed it shut, then closed the curtains with the same forcefulness. I let my own curtain fall. I was a little shell-shocked, I think. Of course, I was perturbed by the sight of the man, by his face and his movement, and the fact that he'd been doing that for who knows how many nights now in an attempt to frighten my kids. However, another detail stuck out as even more concerning to me, which was the fact that I genuinely wasn't sure if the man I had just seen was my neighbor. I'd seen him so few times in the years I'd lived in that house, and I was having trouble conjuring up his face. I sat on the floor for a minute, my blood thundering in my ears. I definitely had enough evidence at that point to call the cops, right? Just as I was about to pull out my phone, I heard a tremendous smack against the glass of the bedroom window. After a brief hesitation, I pulled the curtain back again. There were no lights on in the neighbor's house, and there was also no one outside from what I could see. I pulled the curtains back a little further and saw a handprint in the top corner of the window pane. It's worth noting that our house is on a raised foundation, and that particular window is very tall, so even though the window is on the first floor, the man outside would have needed an insane vertical to get his hand up there. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I explained the situation to them, I quickly walked around the house to see if I could catch a glimpse of the man. My last stop was my bedroom. Once inside, I locked the doors and, while still on the phone with the operator, I took my handgun out of the safe in my closet. My heart was beating out of my damn chest, but I knew I had to stay calm. Even more so when I saw that Alicia was awake and looking out of the tent at me. I reassured her in as few words as I could, whispering that we were okay, but we had to stay very quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed, my firearm ready and my ears straining. My kids' tent was in the corner, and to the left of the tent, in the middle of the wall, and directly across from where I sat, was a window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something. It was a cloudless night, and the moonlight was bright enough that I could see a silhouette through the white curtains. The dark shape was nebulous at first, but became more clear as the man outside stepped closer to the window. Somehow, he knew which room we were in. The silhouette didn't move for several minutes, And I remember being thankful that, from the angle at which she sat, Alicia couldn't see it. Then something happened that I couldn't entirely wrap my head around. The man stepped back from the glass and raised his arms, making a Y shape with his body and his limbs. Only his arms were far too long. They seemed to be double the length that they should have been, each arm about the same length as his entire body. I thought at first that he was holding something, maybe two pipes that just appeared to be an extension of his limbs, but I could clearly see two hands at the ends of the extremities. I could see 5 fingers on each hand, flopping around slightly as the man brought his arms closer to the window. Thud, thud, thud. I stood up and readied myself to shoot, but just then the sounds of sirens pierced the quiet night. The man outside banged his hands against the window one last time, and then it was as if someone had sliced his arms at the elbows. His forearms seemed to shear right off, and the man took off running before they so much as hit the ground. When the police officers announced themselves, I answered the door and explained the situation to them. 2 officers, a man and a woman, asked me a few questions about my neighbor, which I assume was necessary to establish probable cause for a search. Once finished, they told me to stay inside with the doors locked while they investigated the neighbor's house. I watched them through the window of Alicia and Jay's room. They knocked on the neighbor's door, and when no one answered, they tried the front door handle. I watched the unlocked door swing open. The 2 looked at one another and then entered. I'm not sure what they found inside that house. All I know is that when they emerged a few moments later, they both looked very disturbed. When I went outside to ask what they had found, the female officer told me simply, "Your neighbor's dead." The rest of the night was a blur of strangers in uniforms filing in and out of my neighbor's home. Some came to my porch afterwards to ask me questions, and none offered me any answers. They moved with tight-lipped efficiency, their faces guarded, their words clipped. At one point, I wandered to the side of the house and found several people photographing something on the ground outside my bedroom window. Before they could ask me to leave, I made out the gruesome shape of 2 human arms. The kids and I have been staying in my parents' apartment for months, and I think everyone, even Jay, is getting tired of the cramped living situation. We can't stay in the house. Alicia is way too traumatized for that, and I wouldn't be comfortable staying there while the murderer is still at large anyway. I want to sell the damn house, but our story going semi-viral is making that difficult. After all, who would want a house that, thanks to the news, has become permanently associated with phrases like dismemberment and days of torture and victim barely recognizable as human? All right, folks, that wraps up today's terrifying true Reddit stories. I hope you enjoyed these chilling tales. Each one was incredibly fascinating, and the fact that they're all true makes them even scarier, in my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see in the future, what topics you'd like me to cover, and what you enjoyed or didn't enjoy about this video. Your feedback really helps me improve and create content you'll love. If you haven't already, please give this video a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We're aiming for 1,000 subscribers, and your support would mean the world to me. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.